All right, Greg, today we've got Brad Littlejohn talking about his new book, Call to Freedom. And this is a bonus episode, right? It doesn't fit into really our season, but we had the opportunity to interview him about his book. And so we took that opportunity and we're releasing it here right after the book is released. So what did you like about it? What do you think's great?
Yeah, it was a really fun conversation talking about his book on freedom. I mean, it does relate to this topic, but it's adjacent to it.
Mm-hmm.
But just our struggle with the definition. What does it mean to be free? Does that mean you can say and do whatever you want? Are there limits to our freedom? Lawlessness, are laws limits to freedom? And I just think there's a lot of wisdom here, a lot of things for us to consider and think about. What does it mean to actually be free in a biblical terminology and not just in the current sociological term for it? And we got into a lot of other side things too, and technology, and everyone wants to talk about AI, it seems, without even us bringing it up.
Yeah, I mean, getting into kind of the different dimensions and spheres of freedom, I think is one of the real strengths of this. It's not kind of a unilateral freedom it's what is freedom in this sphere? What is freedom from this dimension? And it explores several kind of cross sections of that. So I thought that was really helpful. And so here's Brad Littlejohn. Welcome to Kingdom and Culture, where we equip the King's wardens to know his charge and labor unto glory. I'm David, and with me as always is my co-host Craig. And we interview thinkers and theologians from around the world to explore the themes of faith, culture, and the lordship of Christ. Okay, guys, we're here. We're back with a bonus episode, and we're here with Brad Littlejohn here to talk about his new book called To Freedom: Retrieving Christian Liberty in an Age of License. Brad, it's really good to have you on. Could you go ahead and introduce yourself, who you are, what you do?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me. So
Absolutely.
I am a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. I live in Northern Virginia with my wife, Rachel, and 4 kids. I, until this year, was the president of the Davenant Institute, an organization for kind of retrieving Christian wisdom at the intersection of the church and the academy. Founded that in 2013 and served as president until the beginning of this year. I've done various things some things in higher education for the last few years, a number of things in kind of think tank world. So I've been involved with EPPC for a little while, but I'm full-time there now. And this book is kind of it's sort of a encapsulation of a lot of the research and writing I did from my doctoral dissertation more than a decade ago and over the years since then. And it kind of points the way forward to a lot of the projects I'm wanting to pursue at EPPC as well.
Oh, that's great. And so what we really are excited to talk to you about is this new book called To Freedom. And so could you give us a quick, brief overview of what this book is, what it's aimed at, and what you're hoping to accomplish with it before we really start digging into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason I wrote this book, the reason I've been worried about this topic, interested in this topic for years and years, is because I think there's a real confusion around how to think and talk about freedom in the church in America. On the one hand, we know that freedom is an important concept in the Bible. It's an important part of our faith, this idea of freedom, freedom from the power of sin, freedom in Christ. Luther, for us as Protestants especially, Luther writes his book on the freedom of a Christian. And we talk often a lot about the idea of Christian liberty. So we know that freedom is important to our theology, but freedom is also a very important part of our politics as Americans, especially. We kind of think that's our big selling point. America means freedom. America spreads freedom to the rest of the world. That's what we're all about. Increasingly, though, we found that just kind of lots of different people can invoke the word freedom and mean very different things. I mean, this was particularly clear for Christians in the abortion debate, where the other side would say, we're pro-choice. This is all about freedom, the freedom of a woman to choose. And I think, really, I think that should have been more of a wake-up call to us than it was. It seems to me, we've been dealing with that for 50 years, and Christians should have said, "Whoa, hang on a second here, man. If aborting a child can be framed as an expression of freedom, then we need to think more about how we use this word." Again, the first line in the book, I think, is epigram I take from Princess Bride. You keep on using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. Uh,
Yeah.
and I think that's really kind of the situation that we're in with the word freedom in America. And then, of course, it's sort of expanded to gay marriage, freedom to marry who you want. Um, Transgenderism can be advocated for in terms of freedom. You have this sort of slogan, "My body, my choice," which is interesting. Some conservatives would actually use that slogan in opposing vaccines during COVID. And so we all basically, everyone on the political spectrum wants to say, "Hey, I'm free. I can do what I want. Leave me alone." And we have different pet issues. People on the left want to be left alone, do certain things. People on the right want to be left alone, do other things. But everyone kind of thinks that's what freedom means. But of course, it's not what freedom historically means for us as Christians. Paul says, "Don't use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." So I wonder, the book is kind of dig back in and say, what does the Christian understanding of freedom mean? How does that relate to the political understanding of freedom? And then how should this sort of cash out in terms of how Christians engage contemporary cultural issues? So some people will say, "Yeah, okay, I get that you can have sort of too much of a good thing. Okay, so like freedom is good, but you don't want to have too much freedom." You could put it that way, but that's actually not how I prefer to put it. I prefer to say, no, it's not about too much freedom. It's not about me saying, let's have 60% freedom, or something like that. It's saying that actually we do want to maximize freedom, but we want to maximize freedom in the truest, fullest sense of the word. And our problem is actually our problem is too little freedom. Our problem is an impoverished vision of freedom. And so, I mean, like an example, it's like, because I say ultimately, freedom is definition I give is a capacity for meaningful action. All right, it's a capacity for meaningful action. So you are free when you are able to accomplish something that you consider meaningful that you want to do. You're not free when you're just sort of aimlessly wandering in any direction, right? So there's a kind of directionality that's really involved in the fullest experience of freedom. And that's where the constraints come in, because you actually need constraints in order to be able to move in a particular direction. The example I give, I don't remember if I give this in the book or not, but I like to, with bowling. Okay, it's like your 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 goal is to knock down all the bowling pins. All right, if you want to experience the freedom of being a really good bowler, well, actually, if you're a really good bowler, then you don't need the bumpers. But most of us, we need the bumpers, right? We start. So I say, as human beings, we have a goal that we want to achieve in terms of living as good human beings. But because of sin, we're really bad at it, and we tend to zigzag all over the place. And so the only way that we can have any chance of achieving our goal is if there's something to put us back on track when we zigzag. And so that's the role of law. That's the role of moral law. That's the role of political law, is to kind of keep us zigzagging human beings more or less on course, the way that the bumpers would on a bowling lane. Paul talks about being set free, and then he'll go on to say, "And now we're bond servants of Christ," right? And then, that passage in Galatians I quoted, "Through love, you know, don't use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." And like that word "serve," we're so we sort of sanitize that word, but that means that's the verb form of the word slavery, right? So be slaves of one another, Paul says, because if you aren't voluntarily subordinating yourself to Christ and to the needs of others, and instead are seeking to indulge your freedom, then actually you are enslaved by your desires, and then you are enslaved by other people who will manipulate your desires, right? I mean, that's the thing. The person who thinks, "Oh, I'm maximally free because I just do whatever I want." Well, what does that mean? That means that you are you are the ideal consumer. Those advertisers love you because they can make a lot of money off of you, right? So you're not actually free. You're at the mercy of those who want to profit off of your desires. And then this might sound a little bit to people like, oh, this is a little bit of a downer. Okay, all right. So freedom means just kind of being a doormat, just doing whatever other people want. When do I ever get any me time, right? But I think one of the things that I talk about in the book is the importance of recovering this idea of what I call corporate freedom, the freedom that is experienced by a community, because we don't actually find our happiness or purpose or meaning primarily in what we do as individuals, but in the sense of being part of something larger. And I think so much of the unhappiness of so many moderns is the result of cutting ourselves off from these larger structures of belonging. The family, the church, the bowling league. I mean, there's this famous book, of course, by Robert Putnam called "Bowling Alone," about how people used to primarily bowl in leagues, and it was like a big kind of community thing. Those were your bros, and nowadays most people bowl just sort of as individuals or small groups. So we find our sense of purpose and meaning and identity in belonging to some kind of community. But implicit in that is that then the community we experience our freedom most when the community as a whole is free to act and do things as a community. Now, of course, for a community to act, for a community to be free to act, to make decisions, means that those decisions are in some sense limiting the freedom, and again, I'm using now air quotes, limiting the freedom of the members, but ultimately to experience something better than they otherwise would. So the example I always give is, congregational singing. We it is it's a much more glorious thing to sing, to participate in congregational singing, than it is to sing just as an individual most of the time. I mean, maybe if you're a really really good singer, and you got some really awful people in your congregation, but most of us we can actually experience something much greater and more glorious when we're singing together as a congregation, right? But of course, that singing together means we all got to sing the same thing at the same time. You can't just say, the worship leader can't just stand up and say, hey, everybody just belt out your favorite hymn right now, And so rather, the worship leader chooses what you're going to sing, and he says, and then you don't have the freedom. You don't have the freedom to pick what to sing, okay? You're giving up freedom in this individual sense, but you're gaining this, you're part of an exercise of corporate freedom that's actually better and more enriching.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and it moves me into a question I wanted to ask about. Is in that first chapter of your book, you kind of talked about, with that corporate, you kind of talked about three kind of categories of freedom, or dimensions of freedom that helped clarify for me. You talked about people kind of talk past each other when you're talking about freedom. This person over here means freedom in this way, this person means freedom or liberty in a completely other way. So for you in corporate, you had that individual slash corporate idea, then you had the inward slash outward, and then you had the negative slash positive kind of things. I don't know how much you want to get into the weeds of those things, or you just want to tell people to go buy the book and find out about it. But I don't know if you want to dig into that even a little bit.
So yeah, I can define each of those briefly. So the negative positive is probably the distinction that's maybe used most by political philosophers, and sometimes it's defined in terms of like freedom from versus freedom for, or freedom to. And with the idea being, I think that the dominant way that we talk about or think about freedom nowadays is in terms of this negative freedom, this just sort of being left alone. Nobody's interfering with me, so I can do my own thing. So that's freedom. But that's obviously not adequate, because I say a paraplegic by that token is free to walk around as long as nobody's holding him down. But of course, he's not free to walk around because he doesn't have the capacity to walk around. So there has to be this sort of positive ability rather than just sort of a negative being left alone. And that also kind of relates to, it's not merely a physical ability, but there's a psychological capacity that's necessary. I have to have, and that's where the idea of purpose comes in, right? That unless I have some sense of purpose and some ability to organize my thoughts and my intentions and my actions toward that purpose, I'm not really free to act in any meaningful sense, right? I'm pulled around by all kinds of different whims. and that's really kind of a paralysis rather than freedom. So that's an important aspect of it. I've talked about the individual versus corporate aspect, and then there's also the inward versus outward, which is important to think about. We again tend to think mostly in terms of kind of an outward freedom. What are you free to do out there in the world physically with your body? But there's a more fundamental freedom, which is the inward freedom of the mind and the soul. That is, as I've said, it's a prerequisite to outward freedom. You could have a really good robot that can move around and do a bunch of things in the world and nobody's interfering with
Mm-hmm.
it, but it's not really free because it's not actually exercising free will. It doesn't have the inner freedom that we as human beings do. Um, and similarly, somebody who's enslaved by their desires or by an addiction or something and is free to go out there and buy all the drugs that they want, they're not actually free because they have the outward freedom, but not an inward freedom. And
Hmm.
I think you can have inward freedom actually. So you can't have outward freedom without having inward freedom. I would say, really properly understood, you can have inward freedom without having outward freedom, at least
Mm.
to some extent for a time. And so, like, we're often inspired by stories of some inspirational leader who was in prison, but even while in prison, locked up within the four walls of his cell, nonetheless, composed some amazing poem or book or prayers in his diary, and we can read it and see that his soul remained free and uncowed by his oppressors.
Mm.
Hmm.
Paul and Silas singing in the Philippian jail is an example of this. So, yeah,
Well, even would another example of that even be like, I have freedom to drink, but I choose to not drink, or I have freedom to eat, but I'm fasting, so I also have freedom not to
yeah,
eat.
oh yeah,
Would
yeah,
that fall into
absolutely. So
that
yeah, the
inward outward?
reformers. This is a very important thing for them that that they're in somewhat a similar context to Paul. Paul in the New Testament is dealing with those who have scruples, have dietary scruples drawn
Mm.
from the ceremonial law, and then other Christians who are like, no, that doesn't apply to us anymore. And Paul's saying you might need to give up your freedom to eat these things in order to avoid offending your brothers. And the reformers are in a similar context where you've had all these traditions of Lenten fasting or the things that you were and weren't allowed to eat in according to Roman canon law. And they're saying, nope, you have freedom of a Christian. You're
Mm.
not actually bound by that law. And yet, it may be that just indulging that freedom is going to be counterproductive to the gospel. And so, therefore, you might need to give up that freedom for the sake of your neighbor. And so, so in Lent, you're not supposed to eat meat. And Calvin says, I could refrain from eating meat my entire life and not sacrifice the actual liberty I have as a Christian if I know that I am giving that up as an act of sort of voluntary love for my neighbor and not as a sense of
Mm.
like under spiritual condemnation.
Yeah,
Right.
and so these three dimensions, the inward, outward, the individual, corporate, and the negative, positive, are each of those present in kind of the three realms of freedom or liberty that you talk about, the spiritual, the moral, and the political, or how do they relate to
Yes,
those
yeah, that's
things?
a great question. Yeah, so then what I go on to do in the book sort of the map of three dimensions. Then I look at three different forms of liberty: spiritual, moral, and political, in chapters 2, 3, and 4. And the idea being that you have different combinations of those dimensions
Mm.
operative in those different forms. So in spiritual liberty, you are talking. It is inward, not outward. It has a negative and a positive dimension. The negative would be sort of the freedom from the condemnation of the law, the guilt of sin. The positive dimension would be of course, the love for once freed from the condemnation law, then you are set free to love God and love the neighbor. So that sort of fear being replaced by love is the sort of the negative and the positive dimensions there. But as I said, it's inward and it is fundamentally individual rather than corporate. So spiritual liberty is the property of the kind of the individual soul. And I talk about how it can sometimes is misunderstood. So this is where the doctrine of Christian liberty is sometimes misunderstood to mean an outward liberty of Christian individuals. So, so going back to that fasting example, some would say, okay, I have Christian liberty, so I'm not obligated to fast, and therefore you can't possibly tell me to fast. Okay, well, actually, the reformers said that, well, you could in fact be told to fast. It just depends why you're being told to fast. You can't be
Hmm.
you can't be told that you have to fast as a means of pleasing God, as a matter of divine law. That
Right.
your spiritual state doesn't depend on it. The
Right.
other good reasons why you have to. I mean, there could be there could be a meat shortage. I mean, like actually, this is during World War II, there you had to give up all sorts of things because there wasn't enough to go around. Or more maybe concretely, I think this is hard for us to swallow as I think evangelicals who have lived so long on a certain understanding of Christian liberty. But a church could say, we think it's valuable. So we know that fasting is a good spiritual discipline. So there's no time when you're required by God to fast. But fasting is a good spiritual discipline, and it's more effective if we do it all together. And so we, as an entire church, are actually going to observe this time of fasting. And if you respect your church leaders, then you could say, yes, that I'm going to submit to that for the sake of this kind of moral discipline as a community. And that's not actually a violation of Christian liberty. So I think if you interpret Christian liberty as this outward liberty rather than this inward liberty, then you run into these problems of individual versus corporate. Oh, the church as a community can't do anything because if a church as a community tries to do something, then that's impinging on your Christian liberty. So that's one area where I say, like, keeping the different dimensions clear helps us avoid a misapplication of the doctrine. I could go through, how that sort of applies to moral and political too, but for the sake of time, just read the book.
That's right. Yeah, you don't want to give people too
Yeah.
much, just enough.
That's actually really helpful to understand, and and our podcast, Kingdom and Culture, we focus a lot on cultural engagement, or whatever you want to call it, for Christians that just being involved in the cultural sphere. So this book kind of goes from the spiritual to the moral to the political, and then you have these kind of examples of things in culture, how all these things can apply to that. How do you think this model is helpful for Christians thinking through living in the culture that they're in?
Yeah. So I think the three case studies I give are technology, the free market, and the idea of religious liberty. And I think I start with technology, and I really think that is the most important, and that's where I'm actually focusing a lot of my own work now at EPPC, because I think technology is always a feedback loop. Technology arises out of a set of cultural values. We invent certain kinds of things because they reflect the things
Right.
that we want, that we think are good as a society. But then, having invented them, they then can sort of take on a life of their own, and we start to value different things because of the technology that we have, right? So I think like the car is a good example. The car is developed in a culture that sort of values getting around easily. Like mobility is desirable to us, and we want to get from place to place as conveniently and efficiently as possible. We don't want to be on someone else's schedule. So, boom, car, great. But once the car became widespread, it actually then profoundly reinforced those habits. So then we just sort of take it for granted that I can go wherever I want, whenever I want. I don't need to. I'm not dependent on a community. I can live in one place and work in another place and go to church in another place. And
Right.
and then you can think about then how now that we have some like Zoom technology, it's like, I don't even need to live close to my grandparents because we can always connect on Zoom when we want to. So the technology reflects certain values, then also sort of takes on a life of its own. And in our case, the value that our technologies reflect is this ideal of freedom. And of course, I mean, you can see how the car kind of fits into that, but digital technology all the more so. It's like, how can I have digital technology arises in a culture that is always asking the question, how can I have the maximum number of options with the minimum effort, right?
Mm.
And the internet's like, boom, psh, here you go, world at your fingertips, right? And we we thought, okay, that's what freedom is. That I'll be freer if I have the world at my fingertips, right? But that's a classic example of how no, that's a very one sided view of freedom that turns out to be slavery, or can easily turn out to be slavery if we don't have a sort of virtuous self mastery that is able to keep the tool as a tool. So I think that Christians have been kind of very, because they haven't had a clear way of thinking about freedom, they've been very naive often in the way that they've dealt with certain technologies. So I mean, one place the rubber really meets the road, and this is, my book's actually coming out on the same day that the Supreme Court is hearing a case that I've been involved in doing some work, some advocacy on, which is it's called Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton. So it's I mean, the Free Speech Coalition, in this case, the bad guys. So okay, so I am arguing against freedom in this case, because the freedom in question is the freedom of hardcore pornography websites to make their material available to anyone and everyone without any speed bump, any inconvenience, such as
Mm.
having to prove your age, right? So they're like, well, yeah, we don't really think it's good for kids to, young kids to view our product, but, wouldn't it be terrible if adults, had to have the inconvenience of proving that they are adults before accessing our product, right? So that's, I think to I think to you all and to any of our probably listeners, this podcast, that's kind of a transparently ridiculous claim,
Hmm.
and we would recognize that there are in fact few forms of slavery more profound than the slavery of pornography, both in terms of the people involved in producing it and the people involved in consuming it. And yet, part of the reason this is a case that is going all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's not at all clear how the Supreme Court is going to rule, is because we've set a lot of precedents that say, well, anything that interferes with free speech at all, and defining speech as sort of any conceivable form of communication, um, well, that's bad. You don't want that, because we don't want censorship. And most Christians will be like, oh yeah. I mean, in fact, it concerns me a little bit, is that, like, to the extent that Christians are motivated by issues around technology, they're often most worried. The problem is there's too much censorship on the internet. I'm like, well, I mean, there's not enough censorship of a lot of things. Okay, maybe too much sensitive of some things, but like, censorship is a good thing. We should be censoring pornography websites on children's
The right thing.
devices.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so I think this is one area where we just have we view freedom in so much of these negative terms, like non-interference. We're so
Mhm.
nervous that if you try to put any boundaries, that's taking away freedom, that we've actually sacrificed much more profound freedoms.
Well, it's almost like this technology example. It actually exposes the sources of our freedom, right? For instance, it seems like a lot of this technology freedom is really rooted in this profound selfishness and individualistic thing. Like, my own selfish desires, my own individualistic needs. No one can tell me I don't have these, and no one can take them away from me. And so I'm going to pursue them, and it doesn't matter how it impacts anybody else. And it's this profound kind of selfish nature of freedom. And it kind of relates to even, early writings on technology, and Neil Postman and others, amusing ourselves to death. I mean, what we're doing is we're actually killing ourselves, and we're allowing ourselves just to destroy ourselves. I mean, in the reality is, technology forms us as much as we form it when we don't understand what it's for. And the problem with the Christians is we just adopt everything without even thinking about it. Whether it's cars and how cars have transformed how we relate to each other, or video technology, like in your example of grandparents and being around family, how it just completely transforms how we engage with each other, and not all positive things. And to your point, we see it as this net good because it's like, look at all the things we're able to do instead of considering the wake that sometimes is left in its path, which is
Yeah.
kind of what you're trying to highlight.
Yeah, no, and I think part of the reason that evangelical Christians have been so uncritical about some of these things is we tend to operate with this kind of binary moral categories, right? It's like it's either bad, sinful, or it's not, and then it's a matter of Christian liberty, and so who's to say? And that's where that one of the things I talk about in the book is the importance of this concept of moral freedom, where the reformers could say, and I mean, Paul has this whole section on this in Corinthians, right? All things are lawful, but not all things are edifying. This idea that you could be technically freed to do something. It might not be wrong in itself. It's not a sin issue per se, but it could quickly become sinful. So, I mean, like I give what's the example I just referenced recently, I'm having trouble thinking of a concrete example, but like you could say something like, if I do something once a day, then it's not a sinful thing, right? If I, let's just say, yeah, here's a good example, maybe. So if I'm tuning in, maybe if I tune in to check on my favorite sports team, once during the business day, that's fine. That's not sinful. But if I were to do it 10 times an hour throughout the business day, well, then that would obviously, then it would be a problem because I would be not doing other responsibilities and I would have malformed habits. Similarly, you could say there are things that if one person in society does it, it's not a problem. But if everybody starts doing it, it quickly does become a problem. And so we have to be able to think in terms of like not just sins, but also vices, and not just individual vices, but cultural vices. And so many of these things around technology are things that this isn't sinful to use this thing as such, but it may become sinful for you, or it may even just be that even aside from whether it's sinful for you, it's harmful for our society if that becomes just the norm, that what we all do. So we have to there's a difference between something being an exception and something being a norm. And I think this is where our evangelical moral discourse is often so impoverished, because we've lost this richer range of categories.
Yeah, that's really helpful to think through. And you mentioned at the beginning kind of what your goal was in writing this book, and so maybe wrap back around to that now that we've talked about what your book is and the topics that it covers. If someone reads your book, and this podcast will be releasing right around the time that your book is coming out, and so so let's say one of our listeners picks up your book, they read it, and they're like, "This is awesome." What would your hope be? If they wake up tomorrow, how would you hope that this book has changed them or guided them in their actions or how they live their life or things in that area of just Christian living?
Yeah. So, I mean, I cover a lot of ground. I think there's a lot of potential applications, but I think maybe what I'm perhaps most hopeful that there would be is in this area of thinking in terms of individual and corporate liberty, and a renewed appreciation among Christians for what does it mean for us to exercise freedom as a community together to pursue these goods, and not getting hung up. We just go whenever we try to do something as a community, people get hung up on well, I don't know if I don't know if I'm entirely on board with that, or what about I have conscientious objections, and it's and you can't do anything because you're not allowed to do anything unless you get everybody on board, and that's not how God designed us. So I mean, for instance, with technology, there's been this really interesting shift, pretty dramatic shift just in the last few months on we shouldn't have kids have smartphones in school, and it seems pretty obvious that it's not conducive to learning. But I think even in Christian schools, I think maybe Christian schools may have been ahead of public schools, but it's interesting. Public schools are moving so quickly now. I think in some cases public schools are ahead of some Christian schools now. That you encounter this thing that the school shouldn't be able to make this decision this is a decision for parents, and every parent should be able to decide what is best for their kid, and the school shouldn't impose that on them. And that's sort of, well, it's, when you think about it, it's kind of ridiculous, because it's like, what's the point? What in that case? Okay, if that's what you really believe, then everybody should be homeschooler, right? And some people do that. But if you believe that there should be such things as schools, the idea of such a thing as school is saying this is a moral community. This is an institution that is committed to pursuing certain goods together, which means there's leadership that makes decisions around, curriculum and academic standards and behavioral standards, and tries to create shared norms that to collectively free us for the task of learning and growing into helping children grow into being truly free people, which requires imposing constraints, and it requires making decisions that not everyone's going to agree with. Uh, but that if you want the benefits of life in that community, then you subject yourself to the decisions of that community. So I think that is where I had the experience actually being a school headmaster once, just for a year, and it was interesting to me just how much, even in conservative Christian circles, you would encounter this kind of just deeply seated individualism, where people just are like, "No, I don't know about
Right.
that, because I need to be able to make decisions for my kids, and everybody needs to be able to make their own decisions for their kids." Which, I mean, obviously, there's a God given authority to parents that is not supposed to be usurped by either the church or the school or the state. But I think that can also become a kind of idol, or it can become the freedom of the family as a community is a freedom that is supposed to be exercised within these larger communities. And if that freedom of the family as its autonomous community is asserted over against any other forms of community, then you don't have a healthy church, you don't have a healthy school, you don't have a healthy society. So I hope maybe just sort of a rubber meets the road set of issues that I hope the book is helpful for.
That's great. And we as a church, we happen to have a school, and I happen to be the headmaster of it currently. And so I understand all those examples that you brought up. And we have a uniforms that some families are like, why do we have to do this? And they
Yep.
subtly try to work against it. Or we have, strict no phone policy where, kids that have them have to check them in at the beginning of the day. And yeah, there's always those people that kind of push against those standards of a community. But to your point, it's like, where are we going? What's the main goal, and what's going to help us get there? And these are things that are
Yep.
done in community and decisions made in community. So what I really hear you saying is everyone just needs to listen and do whatever I say as a pastor. And I think we can close it down from there.
Well, my sequel
Amen
book
and
that I
amen.
might write, I don't know, that I want to write is on authority and how to see the proper relationship between authority and freedom.
Right. I can help
Okay,
you with
all
that
right.
book when you're ready. I have some yeah. I guess one maybe last-ish question on this main thing is, I'm curious how writing this book, how these ideas, how has it transformed you and how you have engaged with life in all the kind of spheres of life, family, work, church?
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I think, whenever you write about these things, you then, whenever you're writing about, I guess, topics with moral implications, you can find yourself being pulled up short by realizing that you're being a hypocrite. You're writing about one set of things, and then you're, turning around and, complaining to your wife about, all the stupid features of this community that we have to be a part of. And so it's, helped me, I try to learn to practice what I preach, and it's I think it's very tricky, because the fact is, for instance, let's just think about a matter of church membership, right? So once upon a time, you went to the church you went to because that was the church in your town, and you know, too bad
Right.
if you didn't like the preaching or the singing, or that was the church. And then, maybe then you had some kind of expansion of religious liberty, and you might have a Methodist church and a Baptist church and an Episcopalian church. You'd have a few options, but again, that was it. And you couldn't say, well, I don't feel spiritually fed, so that's what you had to do. Well, now, of course, we do have the fact that we have cars means that we can and most of us do drive past quite a number of churches on the way to the church that we're going to, and we'll say,
Right.
I'm going here because I feel more spiritually fed here, or that a better answer might be, I'm going here because I feel like this is a place where I can serve better. But the first answer is not bad in itself. It is important to be spiritually fed.
Right.
And so, where is the balance between, on the one hand, taking proper advantage of that freedom in the sense of kind of the multiplication of options, taking advantage of that and saying, what, actually things this church kind of stinks and it's not working out and we're going to leave and go here. That could be a healthy thing to do. But when are you in fact called to say, no, this is the community in which I've been placed. These are the shepherds that God placed me under.
Right.
I don't love all the decisions they're making, but I need to cultivate the freedom that comes through, acceptance of those norms and boundaries, and so I think that is in a sense, this is much more difficult. Some of what I've said before could sound like, Christians used to understand these things, and now we modern evangelicals, we're just stupid and we don't get how freedom is supposed to work. But we have a much harder job in many ways than centuries ago, because we really do have to say, okay, we objectively have more options. When is it healthy to make use of those options, and when is it healthy to renounce those options? And I've definitely had to think about this in my own life in the course of writing. In the course right around the time I finished this book, I left my job. We moved state. We left, switched churches, and we changed everything, right? And while I was writing this book, I was like laboring through the struggles of being in a community that was maybe not ideal in various ways. And so ultimately I used many of the freedoms that I have as an American to kind of make a lot of changes that I think were absolutely the right thing for our family and my vocation and so on. But I think you have to be self-aware and ask yourself those questions of, am I just being just sort of an unstable, a double-minded, unstable person who's just kind of chasing whatever opportunity because I have the freedom to do so.
Well, and those are real world problems. I mean, even as a pastor, as you can imagine, people come into our doors coming from another church, and maybe they're looking for something, and it's hard as a pastor because you want to grow your church, you want more people to come. But even for me, I have to exercise my freedoms to tell people, hey, just that problem that you're looking to get over is not going to get solved actually here. And maybe the best thing for you, even though you're a doctor and you probably tithe, is to stay where you're at. And those are challenging things to constantly have wisdom about. And I think that's where you're right. It's having self-awareness that just because we have the freedom doesn't mean it is right to exercise it. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge in an American culture is we've been ingrained in this. You have the freedom, exercise it. And it's like, you have the freedom, so maybe you don't exercise it. And maybe that is the greater freedom is actually being able to lay it down, which that is such a hard thing for anybody. And even saying it out loud is like, I don't know if I do that enough. Which is what you're wrestling with as you write this. But I mean, and what you described there is what I wrestle with every time I prepare a sermon. It's the same thing. You're studying, you're going through this, and you're like, holy smokes, I'm about to talk to people about this, and I struggle with the very thing I'm talking about. Most of the time I'm just preaching to myself, which is, I suppose the human condition and why we're ultimately disciples of Christ and not disciples of Brad or Craig or especially David.
Well, I mean, this brings us, especially being my disciples, brings me to a good point. I'm just kidding. This is a helpful conversation, Brad. Is there anything that you want to say in closing that we didn't cover or talk about in the rest of the interview that you think would be important for people to know? Obviously, you should tell them where to buy your book. Where to
exercise your freedom to buy a copy for everybody that you know.
Exactly.
And then maybe a few extras, just in case. Yeah.
Just in case you lose one.
Anything else I would say? I mean, if you're interested in these topics, follow my Substack, bradlittlejohn.substack.com. So I write about a lot of these issues. And in particular, as I said, a lot of my focus has been kind of developing the chapter on technology in terms of what we as individuals can do, what churches can do, what political authorities should do in helping us to actually use technology in a way that enhances freedom. So I hope you'll tune into that and follow the work that I'm continuing to develop on that.
Yes, I encourage people to go follow you there and follow your work. I think it's been extremely helpful for me to follow you and read your writings. But and could you tell people where they can buy your
Oh
book?
yeah,
Is it Amazon? Would that be the
yeah. I
best
mean, I
spot?
guess I might rave against big tech, but ultimately, probably Amazon's
It
Amazon's the
works.
place.
Yeah.
I mean, it's published by B&H, which is Lifeway, part of Lifeway, so you can buy it from the. You don't want to give a little bit of your money to the man. You can buy it directly from Lifeway Christian Resources. So
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time, Brad. It's been a really fun interview.
yeah, absolutely, my pleasure.
All right, guys. We'll go check out our Patreon, check out our website, and until next time, labora ad gloriam.
We labor unto glory.